international reputation. So the result is that people feel very strongly about what we do, but nonetheless, that's what we do. And in my job as Jerusalem correspondent, I have two completely contradictory narratives. Many of my colleagues have more than one story to cover. Our Rome correspondent, for example, Rachel Donadio, she covers Rome, or Italy, Portugal, Spain. Different stories, different kinds of, but not black, white, black, white, black, white, which is what I cover. Every single thing that the Israelis feel, the Palestinians feel basically the opposite. Every single detail and event and place has a different timbre and a different name and a different feeling for each side. So it makes writing about it extremely challenging. You take, for example, that holy spot inside Jerusalem where the Jews had a temple 2,000 years ago and where there are mosques today. Is it the Temple Mount or is it the noble sanctuary? Well, it is both. So which do you put first when you're writing? And that, depending on which you put first, tells people, or they think it tells people, something about your view of historical rights there. The Jews were there first, but there are a lot more Muslims, and they've been there a long time too. So it's very difficult. Think about that thing snaking its way down along the boundary between Israel and the West Bank, which the Israelis call a fence, because that sounds so neighborly, which the Palestinians call a wall, because that sounds so aggressive, and which the New York Times calls a barrier, because we hope it doesn't sound like anything. When we came to the conclusion about what we should call that thing, we spent some time on it. The fact is, most of the hundreds of kilometers are not wall, but some of the most prominent parts are, in particular in Jerusalem. And it's quite a sight. Any pictures you've seen are basically of the wall, but most of it is fencing. Okay, anyway, the idea is it's a barrier, and that's what we thought would be a good name for it. We came to that conclusion in 2003 when I was the deputy, no, I was still in the editorial page, then I became a deputy foreign editor. And a friend of mine who belonged to an Orthodox congregation in Westchester asked me to speak to the congregation, and I went and gave a talk in which I included a discussion of the language problem that I'm giving you now. And at the end of the talk, a woman came up to me and asked me a question, and then I answered her. And in the course of my answer, I used the word barrier. And she started poking me in the chest and says, fence. You're talking to a fence person now. So the idea is that the whole concept of neutrality struck her as simply out of her experience, out of her desire. Do not try to get in the middle. Come to one side or the other. Right now, if you're following the conflict, you know that it is not a moment of great optimism. It seems that Middle East peace negotiations don't have a great future. It is true that Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister, did say today, if you read any websites, that he believes that in the coming weeks there is a decent possibility or a chance that talks will be begun again without preconditions, as he put it. I'm not sure what he's basing it on. What I've seen and what Palestinians have said, Palestinian leadership, they are not particularly eager. On the other hand, they do feel a little trapped as well in the fact that nothing is happening. It's been more than a year since the two sides have held peace talks. They broke apart right as the Gaza war got started a little more than a year ago and have not started up since. My sense is that actually, in a funny way, each side feels that time is kind of on its side. In other words, for the Palestinians, there is this sense that, well, the whole world accepts our argument that these settlements are wrong, that East Jerusalem needs to either be divided or shared, and that we deserve a state. There is not a country that feels otherwise, not even the American government, in theory, feels otherwise. So why should we sit down with this government that doesn't accept those things and get nowhere once again and look like fools in front of our people while Hamas is yelling to them about how inadequate we are? So we'll just wait it out. I think there is a strong feeling among certain Palestinian leaders that it is worth waiting out. On the Israeli side, there is a feeling that the American government has come to understand its much better than it did in the beginning of the Obama administration when there was a lot of conflict over settlements. So you will recall that right after the administration came in, it demanded a total freeze of settlements, and the Israelis were like, what? We've never had to do that before, and there was a lot of tension, and they've, over the course of months, come to this idea of a moratorium, a 10-month freeze or pause, to some extent, in the West Bank, to not include East Jerusalem. And now the thrust of the administration's efforts are to get the Palestinians back to the table. They've been talking to the Europeans, to the Jordanians, the Egyptians, to get everybody to tell Mahmoud Abbas, the president of the Palestinian Authority, it's time to come back and talk. The Israelis have done a lot of, the Israelis have made a lot of changes in their economic policy in the West Bank. They've done this freeze. They've done what they can. Let's get going. Their time is limited. So, and I think that even a guy like Netanyahu, who, whose intentions may not even be clear to himself, they're certainly not clear to me, probably is divided down the middle in himself about what he thinks can happen and should happen. On the one hand, let's get going and start the negotiations and cut a two-state deal. On the other hand, if these guys are not going to come to the table, a little more building, a little more waiting. Maybe the West Bank will end up sort of under Jordanian aegis, maybe Gaza under Egyptian, and maybe we'll be able to have a suddenly expanded state and we won't have to deal with this state. I think that both thoughts he goes to sleep with at night. Now here, I imagine looking at this conflict and reading it with any care that you can, it must seem to you that Israel is in a little bit of trouble. The Goldstone report, after all, this UN commission, that council that required an investigation of what happened in Gaza, came up with a very, very damning, harsh description of what Israel did and accusations of war crimes. And it must seem to you that the Israeli military must be in kind of a funk. But the most fascinating thing to me, observing what's going on there, is that the Israeli military is not in a funk. The Israeli military right now, whether it should or shouldn't be, we can discuss later, actually feels very much on the horse in Israel. It's one of the only institutions that functions, from an Israeli perspective, very well. So that however harsh or brutal or whatever it seems to you has happened, just look at the operation of the last 8 years or so. Israel went to war in Gaza to stop rockets from coming in. Now, 2 did land today, but basically the rockets were stopped. Israel went to war in Lebanon in 2006 to stop Hezbollah from infiltrating in the northern border and shooting rockets. Those things have stopped. Okay, the truth is that the northern border is quieter, more peaceful than it has been since the 1960s, despite the fact that that war seemed so troubling from a distance and from up close. The fact is, it worked from the military's perspective. Look at what happened in the West Bank. In 2002, the Israeli military went back in, reconquered the cities that had been given back to the Palestinians in the mid-1990s. And by reconquering the cities and fairly harsh military activity and arrest and to some extent killing, they have ended terrorism from the Palestinian West Bank into Israel. They've ended. There basically is none. So that today, in Israel, there is peace in a funny way, north, south, and east. The paradox, of course, is that Israel has never been more diplomatically isolated, not never, but not in about 20 years, because of the sense that these things that they're doing, that they view as protecting themselves, are actually too harsh, too brutal, and need to be criticized internationally. But if you also look at